Hey guys, tonight we are going to travel back to a time and place where holding your breath was a genuine survival skill. We're drifting into the heart of Victorian London, specifically the summer of 1858. The air around you is thick, almost chewy, a rich tapestry of smells that your 21st century nose is simply not equipped to handle. It's a warm, humid evening, and the city's signature perfume, a complex blend of coal smoke, horse manure, and unwashed humanity, is particularly potent. You probably wouldn't survive the water, let alone the air, but from the safety of your bed, it's just a strange, distant dream. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. It's always fun to see where everyone is listening from, so feel free to drop your city and local time in the comments below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine you were standing on a street corner, not far from the River Thames. The gas lamps have just begun to sputter to life, casting a hazy, golden glow on the slick cobblestones. The first thing you notice isn't a sight, but a feeling. The air is heavy, clinging to your skin like a damp wool blanket. And then comes the smell. It's not one single odor, but a symphony of them. A layered, complex miasma that tells the story of 2 million people living on top of one another. At the base, there's the ever-present scent of coal smoke, pouring from countless chimney pots, a gritty, sulfuric tang that catches in the back of your throat. This was the engine of the Industrial Revolution, the very smell of progress, and it coated every surface in a fine layer of black soot. You can feel the grit on your teeth. Beneath that, you detect the smell of the horses, thousands upon thousands of them, pulling carts, omnibuses, and hansom cabs. They are the city's horsepower, and they leave behind a staggering amount of waste on the streets every single day. The clatter of their iron-shod hoofs is a constant rhythm, but their contribution to the city's aroma is far more permanent. Now, add to this the smell of industry itself. From the local tanneries comes the sharp chemical reek of curing leather, an odor so aggressive it seems to scour the inside of your nostrils. Down the road, a brewery is venting steam, sending a yeasty, malty cloud to mingle with the rest. And everywhere there's the smell of unwashed bodies, of damp wool, of cheap gin spilling from a pub doorway, and of food being cooked over open fires, sausages, onions, and meat pies of questionable origin. It's a complete sensory overload. You might think people would just get used to it, and perhaps they did to some extent. Historians still argue whether the average Londoner was truly nose-blind to the constant assault, or if it was a source of daily, unspoken misery that simply had to be endured. But these are just the surface smells, the everyday perfume of the world's largest, wealthiest city. The real problem, the one that is about to bring this metropolis to its knees, is coming from beneath your feet. It's a deeper, more sinister scent, a foul, cloying sweetness of decay. It's seeping up from the drains, from the gutters, and most of all, from the river. For centuries, Londoners had relied on cesspits, which were essentially brick-lined pits dug in the basements or backyards of their homes. When one got full, you'd hire a team of men called night soil men to come empty it, usually under the cover of darkness to minimize the public relations fallout. It was an unpleasant but vaguely functional system for a smaller city, but London wasn't a small city anymore. It had exploded, growing from 1 million to over 2 million people in the first half of the 19th century alone. There was simply no more room for cesspits, and not enough night soil men in the world to empty them all. So, in a well-intentioned but disastrously misguided move, the authorities decreed that all new homes must be connected directly to the nearest sewer. And where did the sewers go? Straight into the Thames. This decision, combined with the popularization of the newfangled flush toilet, turned London's ancient network of sewers, originally designed just to carry rainwater, into a main line for human waste. And the river, the majestic heart of the city, became a slow-moving open sewer. As you walk closer to the water's edge, that deeper smell intensifies. It's a sickening organic stench, the smell of a colossal digestive system failing in public. You can see the river, but it doesn't look like water. It's a thick, brown, viscous slurry, with strange things bobbing on its surface. You might even spot a tosher, one of the city's desperate poor, wading thigh-deep in the muck near the shore, sifting through the filth for lost coins, bits of metal, or anything else they could sell. It's a vision from a nightmare, but for them, it's just another Tuesday. This river, which provided much of the city's drinking water, was now its greatest shame and its most terrifying threat. And as the summer of 1858 began, a relentless heat wave would turn this simmering problem into an unbearable city-stopping crisis. That deep, gut-wrenching smell rising from the Thames isn't just an assault on your senses. To you, a person living in 1858, it is a direct and imminent threat to your life. You don't just smell it, you feel it. You believe you are breathing in your own death. This wasn't simple disgust. It was a deeply ingrained, scientifically endorsed terror based on the reigning medical theory of the day, the miasma theory. The word itself comes from the ancient Greek for pollution or bad air, and the idea was just as old. For centuries, the best medical minds believed that diseases like cholera, chlamydia, and the Black Death were caused by miasmata, poisonous, foul-smelling vapors that rose from decaying organic matter. Swamps, graveyards, garbage pits, and of course a river filled with human waste were seen as factories for this invisible poison. It's a theory that makes a sort of intuitive sense if you don't think about it too hard. Things that smell bad, like rotting food or filth, are often associated with sickness. Therefore, the smell itself must be the cause. In your world, this isn't a fringe belief. It is the absolute, unquestioned medical orthodoxy. It's taught in the finest universities and championed by the most respected public health reformers, including the formidable Florence Nightingale herself. She famously wrote that disease was the reaction of a living body to effluvia from decomposing matter. In her mind, the key to a healthy hospital wasn't necessarily scrubbing the instruments, but ensuring a constant flow of fresh, non-smelly air. So as you stand there, breathing in the thick London air, every whiff of putrescence feels like a tiny, invisible dart of poison entering your lungs. This belief shapes your entire existence. You see a wealthy gentleman walking by, holding a perfumed handkerchief to his face. It's not just an act of snobbery, it's a desperate attempt at self-preservation. In his pocket, he might carry a pomander, a small metal ball filled with aromatic spices like ambergris or musk, a personal air freshener against the deadly city air. It's the 19th century equivalent of wearing a garlic necklace to ward off vampires, only this was considered cutting-edge science. In your home, your family likely burns lavender or rosemary, or perhaps even vinegar, to purify the air inside, a constant fragrant battle against the encroaching stench from the street. Windows are kept shut tight, especially at night, for fear that the nocturnal miasmas, considered the most potent, might creep in while you sleep. The irony, of course, is that sealing up your home just concentrates the germs that are actually making you sick. Historians still debate the extent to which the miasma theory was a net negative. On one hand, it focused all medical attention on the wrong culprit, smell instead of germs, delaying the acceptance of the truth for decades. On the other hand, a war on bad smells often inadvertently led to a war on the filth that created them. Cleaning up a smelly garbage heap might not disperse a poison cloud, but it does get rid of the rats and flies that carry disease. So, by fighting the wrong enemy, miasmatists sometimes stumbled into the right solutions, a bit like trying to fix a computer by dusting it and accidentally plugging in a loose cable. This focus on sanitation, ventilation, and cleanliness, driven by a flawed theory, did lead to some genuine public health improvements. But here, in the summer of 1858, the theory is mostly just a source of paralyzing fear. The language used in newspapers and official reports is apocalyptic. They speak of a pestilential vapor, a noxious effluvium, an invisible tide of death washing over the city from the river. There were even pseudo-scientific attempts to quantify it. Observers would note the way mist clung to the river at dawn, believing they were witnessing the miasma in its physical form. Some doctors even tasted the water from different parts of the Thames, noting its varying degrees of foulness as a supposed measure of its toxicity. The idea that you could diagnose a river's deadliness by its flavor is a special kind of Victorian confidence. As you look at the sluggish brown water, you don't just see a polluted river. You see a monster, exhaling a breath so foul that it can stop your heart. Every bubble that breaks the surface is, in your mind, releasing a tiny pocket of concentrated plague. This is why the heat wave that is about to settle over London is so terrifying. It's not just the discomfort of the heat and humidity. It's the fear that the sun will bake the river, cooking up an even more potent and widespread batch of deadly miasma, enough to finally overwhelm the entire city. The enemy wasn't a microscopic organism you couldn't see. It was a smell you couldn't escape. Let's turn our attention back to the source of that terrible miasma, the River Thames. To understand how it got this bad, you have to realize that this river isn't just a feature of London. For centuries, it was London. It was the city's first highway, its main source of drinking water, its power source for mills, a place for recreation, and most importantly, its only sewer. This wasn't a recent development. The Romans, when they founded Londinium, channeled their waste into the Thames. For nearly 2,000 years, the river had been swallowing the city's refuse. For most of that time, the system, while not exactly pleasant, was manageable. The river was wide and tidal, meaning twice a day, the powerful outgoing tide would act as a natural flushing mechanism, carrying the city's filth out to sea. London was smaller, and its waste was mostly organic. The Thames could handle it. It had a natural resilience. But then came the 19th century, your world. London explodes. The population doubles, then triples. The Industrial Revolution lines the river's banks with factories, tanneries, slaughterhouses, and gasworks, each one using the river as its personal dumping ground. Suddenly, the waste isn't just organic, it's a toxic chemical cocktail. Arsenic from leather tanning, ammonia from gas production, lead from paint factories. All of it pours directly into the water, unstrained and unregulated. The river's ecosystem begins to collapse. The famous Thames salmon, once so plentiful that apprentices in the 17th century supposedly complained about being fed it too often, completely disappear by the 1830s. The river is dying. And then comes the decisive blow we touched on earlier, the push to abolish cesspools. A key public health reformer, Edwin Chadwick, a man utterly convinced by the miasma theory, saw the overflowing, stinking cesspits as the primary source of London's deadly air. In his influential 1842 report, The Sanitary Condition of the Labouring Population, he argued passionately that all smell is disease. His solution was simple, and, he thought, elegant. Use the city's existing network of sewers to carry all waste directly into the river where the tides would wash it away. He championed the new marvelous invention of the water closet, the flush toilet, as a key part of this hygienic revolution. No more foul-smelling pits in your basement, just pull a chain and water whisks the problem away. It's a classic case of a solution creating a much, much bigger problem. The old sewers of London were not designed for this. They were mostly small, brick-lined tunnels intended to carry rainwater off the streets. Now they were being flooded with a thick, semi-solid sludge they couldn't handle. They choked, they backed up, and foul-smelling gases were forced back up into people's homes, which, for a miasmatist like Chadwick, was the ultimate nightmare. But the bigger disaster was what happened when the waste finally did reach the river. The sheer volume was overwhelming. The old tidal flush was no match for the relentless flow from a city of over 2 million people, each using their brand new flush toilets. The river stopped being a river and became a holding tank. You are walking along the bank now, near one of the sewer outlets. The largest of these, like the Fleet Ditch, were once actual rivers themselves, but they had become so polluted that they were eventually covered over and turned into subterranean sewers. Here, at its mouth, you can see a thick black torrent gushing into the already brown Thames. The smell is concentrated, almost physical. Historians still argue whether the Thames was technically dead at this point, but for all practical purposes, it was an anaerobic body of water. There was so much organic waste that bacteria consumed all the available oxygen in the water, leading to a process of putrefaction that released hydrogen sulfide, the gas that gives rotten eggs their distinctive sickening smell. This is the source of the Great Stink's unique foulness. Making matters worse is the river's tidal nature, the very feature that was supposed to save it. The waste didn't just flow out to sea. The incoming tide from the estuary would push the sewage back upstream, past the Houses of Parliament, through the heart of the city. Then the ebb tide would pull it back down. The filth didn't leave, it just sloshed back and forth in the middle of London, a grotesque, twice-daily soap opera of human waste. It was famously said that a piece of sewage dropped at London Bridge would oscillate up and down the river for weeks before finally making its way out to sea. One quirky tidbit from the era is the rise of the mudlarks, often young children, who would scavenge the riverbanks at low tide. Unlike the toshers in the sewers, mudlarks searched the exposed, stinking mud for bits of coal, rope, or old iron that had fallen from ships. It was a miserable, dangerous existence, wading through a toxic landscape for pennies. Their ghostly little figures, covered head to toe in black slime, were a common sight, a living testament to the river's degradation. The Thames, once the city's pride, was now its most profound source of shame and terror. It was an open sewer, miles long and hundreds of feet wide, and in the summer of 1858, it was about to cook. Beneath the palpable fear of miasma, a more insidious and far deadlier threat was moving silently through London's population. It had no smell, no taste, and no name that people truly understood. They called it King Cholera, and unlike the theoretical threat of miasma, this killer was brutally real. Your London has already suffered through 3 massive cholera epidemics, in 1832, 1849, and again in 1854. Together, they killed over 30,000 Londoners in a horrific fashion. Cholera is a terrifyingly swift and vicious disease. One moment you could be perfectly healthy, and within hours you are struck down by violent sickness and diarrhea, leading to rapid dehydration, muscle cramps, and a bluish tint to the skin as your circulatory system collapses. Death could come in less than a day. In the grip of these epidemics, the city was a place of panic. People burned barrels of tar and vinegar in the streets, a desperate public fumigation against the dreaded miasma they believed was the cause. Special cholera hospitals were set up, but they were often seen as death houses, places to be avoided at all costs. The wealthy fled to their country estates, leaving the poor crowded into teeming slums with the worst sanitation to face the brunt of the disease. This is the mainstream historical fact of the era. Cholera was a recurring nightmare that shaped public consciousness and drove the very sanitary reforms that, ironically, worsened the pollution of the Thames. Edwin Chadwick's crusade to flush all waste into the river was a direct response to the cholera terror of the 1840s. He was trying to eliminate the cesspit miasmas, convinced he was saving the city. In this atmosphere of fear and flawed science, one man began to suspect that everyone was looking in the wrong place. His name was Dr. John Snow, a quiet, methodical anesthetist. He is a rather unassuming hero in our story. Snow didn't believe in the miasma theory. His skepticism came from simple logical observation. Why, he wondered, did cholera often seem to follow specific paths through a neighborhood, striking one house while leaving the one next door untouched? A poisonous cloud of miasma should be far more indiscriminate. And why did coal miners, who spent their days deep underground breathing the foulest air imaginable, seem to suffer from cholera far less than the general population? The theory just didn't add up. Snow had a radical, almost unthinkable idea. Perhaps cholera wasn't a gas you breathed in, but something you swallowed. Perhaps it was a poison, a morbid matter, that was being spread through contaminated water. He first published his theory in 1849, but it was almost completely ignored by the medical establishment. They were too invested in the grand, dramatic narrative of the miasma. The idea of a tiny invisible poison in a glass of clear-looking water seemed small and, frankly, a bit silly by comparison. It was during the 1854 epidemic that Snow found his chance to prove it. A massive cholera outbreak erupted in the Soho district, a neighborhood he knew well. It was swift and brutal, killing over 500 people in just 10 days within a few city blocks. This is where our quirky historical tidbit comes in. While the authorities were busy ordering the flushing of sewers to clear the local miasma, an act which likely made the outbreak worse, Snow began his own investigation. He went door to door, like a detective, with a map of the neighborhood. He talked to the families of the victims, recording the details of each death and marking its location on his map. A clear pattern began to emerge. The deaths were all clustered around a single public water pump on Broad Street, now Broadwick Street. He discovered that workers at a local brewery near the pump, who were given a daily allowance of beer and drank very little water, were almost completely unaffected. He found a widow who had moved out of the neighborhood but had water from the Broad Street pump sent to her by cart every day because she liked the taste. She and her niece both died of cholera. Prisoners in the local workhouse, which had its own well and didn't use the Broad Street pump, were also spared. The evidence was overwhelming. Armed with his now famous dot map, which visually demonstrated the cluster of deaths around the pump, Snow went to the local Board of Guardians. Historians still debate the exact nature of this meeting. Some accounts portray it as a dramatic showdown, with Snow passionately convincing a skeptical committee. Others suggest a more mundane bureaucratic process. Either way, he managed to persuade them to take the handle off the pump. The story often ends there, with the outbreak magically stopping. The reality is that the outbreak was already waning by the time the handle was removed. But Snow's investigation continued. He later discovered that the well for the Broad Street pump had been contaminated by a leaky cesspit just a few feet away, where the diapers of a baby who had died of cholera a few days before the outbreak began had been thrown. It was the smoking gun. He had found the invisible killer. Yet, despite this masterpiece of epidemiology, the medical establishment remained unconvinced. The Board of Health officially declared that Snow's theory was untenable and that the outbreak was still caused by miasma from a faulty sewer. His meticulous work was dismissed for years. As you stand in the London of 1858, John Snow is still a fringe figure, a respected anesthetist, but a crank on the subject of cholera. His germ theory of disease is a whisper, drowned out by the roar of the miasma theory. The city is terrified of the smelly air, all while continuing to drink the water that is actually killing them. As the calendar turns to June of 1858, your London starts to swelter. A heat wave descends upon the city. A period of unusually hot, dry weather. In a world without air conditioning, this is already a miserable experience. The stone and brick of the city absorb the sun's heat, radiating it back through the night. People feel lethargic, irritable. But this year, the heat is doing something else. It is acting as a giant oven, baking the thick, sewage-laden sludge of the River Thames under the relentless sun. The process of decomposition accelerates dramatically. The bacteria in the river, feasting on the endless supply of organic waste, go into overdrive, releasing colossal volumes of foul-smelling gases, primarily hydrogen sulfide and methane. The great stink begins. The smell is no longer just an unpleasant background note to city life. It becomes an overwhelming physical presence. It's a living entity that crawls through the streets, seeps under doorways, and invades every home, from the poorest slum tenement to the grandest Belgravia mansion. It is described by writers of the time in visceral, almost biblical terms. It was a pestiferous and typhus-breeding horror, an abomination, a Stygian pool reeking with ineffable and unbearable horror. One writer for the city press noted, "The smell was something that literally you could taste as well as smell. It was a thick, foul, cloying taste that stuck to the back of the throat." People walk around with cloths soaked in camphor or vinegar pressed to their faces. The sale of perfume and smelling salts skyrockets. It's a city under siege by an invisible, suffocating fog. At the heart of the city, and at the heart of our story, are the Houses of Parliament, sitting right on the northern bank of the river. This is where the men who governed the British Empire, the wealthiest and most powerful nation on earth, came to work. And now their majestic workplace has become unbearable. The smell wafting in from the river is so overpowering that it brings the business of government to a grinding halt. The mainstream historical fact of this section is this very parliamentary paralysis. Politicians, who for years had debated the Thames question with little urgency, were suddenly confronted with the problem in the most personal way imaginable. They couldn't ignore it because they couldn't breathe. Imagine you are a member of Parliament during that fateful summer. You arrive for your daily session in the newly rebuilt Palace of Westminster, a grand Gothic revival masterpiece. But as you enter the committee rooms overlooking the river, the stench hits you like a physical blow. The government's first response is a classic of denial and inadequate solutions. They order that the curtains of the palace be soaked in chloride of lime, a bleaching agent with a sharp chemical smell, in a desperate attempt to mask the odor. Huge quantities of it are poured onto the curtains, the floors, anywhere they think might help. The result is a bizarre and nauseating cocktail of scent, the acrid tang of bleach layered over the deep, organic foulness of the river. It helps a little, but the great stink is too powerful. It punches right through the chemical barrier. The heat continues. The stink worsens. Debates in the House of Commons are cut short as MPs begin to feel physically ill, some even faint. The government is forced to consider abandoning Westminster altogether, perhaps relocating to Oxford or St. Albans. This is a national embarrassment. The mighty British Empire, ruler of a quarter of the world's population, is being driven from its own capital by a bad smell. This is where a quirky tidbit of the story emerges, the letters exchanged between politicians. Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, a man known for his wit, describes the river as a Stygian pool from which ascended a pestilential vapor. In one famous parliamentary debate, another MP, John Brady, directly informs the Speaker that by sitting with the river just yards from his chair, he is risking his life. He wasn't being dramatic. In a world that believed in miasma, this was a statement of pure fact. The river wasn't just disgusting, it was actively trying to murder them. Historians still argue about how much of the political action that followed was driven by genuine fear for public health versus the simple, selfish desire of the powerful to make their own workplace tolerable. Was it a moment of enlightened public service or the ultimate "not in my backyard" problem? The truth is likely a mixture of both. But the immediate effect was to galvanize a previously gridlocked political system. For years, various commissions had proposed dozens of different competing schemes to clean up the Thames, all of which had stalled due to cost, political infighting, and a general lack of will. But now, in the face of the great stink, the time for debate was over. The problem had to be solved, and it had to be solved now. Disraeli, despite being from the opposition party, introduces a bill, the Metropolis Local Management Amendment Act, giving the go-ahead for a massive new sewer system, and, crucially, the funds to build it. The bill, which had been languishing for years, is rushed through Parliament in a record-breaking 18 days. The Great Stink had done what decades of reports and thousands of cholera deaths could not. It had forced the hand of power. The unbearable smell finally made the invisible threat of disease impossible to ignore. A solution was coming, and it would be placed in the hands of one remarkably calm and capable man. With Parliament choking on the Great Stink, and a mandate for action finally in place, the responsibility for solving this colossal problem falls upon the shoulders of one man. His name is Joseph Bazalgette, and he is the chief engineer for the London Metropolitan Board of Works. He is, in almost every way, the perfect antidote to the chaotic, foul-smelling crisis gripping the city. Where London is messy and hysterical, Bazalgette is methodical, precise, and unflappably calm. He is not a flamboyant genius in the mold of some of his Victorian contemporaries, like Isambard Kingdom Brunel. You won't find him posing for dramatic photographs in front of his creations. Instead, he's a quiet, diligent, and deeply serious professional who combines a mastery of engineering with an incredible talent for navigating the treacherous waters of bureaucracy and politics. Imagine you are a junior draftsman in his office in the late 1850s. The office itself is an oasis of order. Maps are neatly rolled, instruments are polished, and ledgers are filled with immaculate handwriting. At the center of it all is Bazalgette. He is in his late 30s, a handsome man with a prominent forehead, sharp eyes, and a neatly trimmed beard. He speaks in a measured, confident tone, never raising his voice. He has a reputation for being a demanding boss, a stickler for detail, who will check and recheck every calculation. This meticulousness is one of his defining traits. He once famously said, "The works must be constructed so that they will not only be sufficient for the present, but for the future wants of the metropolis." This foresight is perhaps his greatest gift. He isn't just trying to solve the problem of 1858. He is planning for a London of the distant future. Bazalgette was not a newcomer to the problem. He had been working on plans for a new sewer system for years, submitting various proposals that had been repeatedly rejected or altered by a dizzying array of competing committees and government bodies. He had endured endless political meddling and bureaucratic obstruction. One of his early plans was even derided in the press as the most monstrous and expensive job of all time. He had to fight against rival engineers promoting their own schemes, and against politicians who balked at the astronomical cost of his vision. This period of frustration is a key part of his story. It forged in him a kind of patient resilience. He knew his plan was the right one, and he was prepared to wait, refining his calculations and strengthening his arguments until the moment was right. The Great Stink was that moment. It silenced his critics and swept away the political obstacles. Suddenly, the plan that had been dismissed as too expensive was now hailed as the city's only salvation. One of the mainstream historical facts about Bazalgette is his incredible work ethic. During the peak of the project, he was known to work almost around the clock, overseeing every aspect of the design and construction. He was a hands-on manager, frequently visiting the work sites to inspect the progress and solve problems on the spot. But he was also a master delegator, surrounded by a team of talented young engineers whom he trusted and mentored. His leadership style was one of quiet authority, based on his undeniable competence. People followed his lead because they knew he was the smartest person in the room. Now, for a quirky tidbit that reveals the man behind the engineer. Joseph Bazalgette came from a family of French Huguenot immigrants, a background that perhaps contributed to his outsider's perspective and his relentless drive to prove himself. More surprisingly, early in his career, while working on railway projects, he suffered a complete nervous breakdown from overwork. He was forced to take a year off to recover. This experience seems to have taught him a valuable lesson about his own limits. The man who took on the great stink was not a reckless workaholic, but a man who had learned the importance of sustainable effort and careful planning. He understood that this project would be a marathon, not a sprint, and he paced himself accordingly. This earlier brush with burnout made him the calm, steady hand the city so desperately needed. Historians still debate the degree to which Bazalgette understood the true nature of the problem he was solving. He was, like almost all his contemporaries, a believer in the miasma theory. His stated goal was to get the foul-smelling sewage out of the city as quickly as possible, to prevent it from generating deadly miasmas. He wasn't consciously fighting waterborne bacteria. He was fighting a bad smell. The language in his own reports speaks of intercepting the sewage so that its products may be prevented from contaminating the atmosphere of the metropolis. He built his system to cure a disease of the air. The fact that he would accidentally cure a disease of the water is one of history's most fortunate and consequential mistakes. As you watch him poring over his maps, you see a man driven by a flawed theory but guided by brilliant engineering. He may have misunderstood the enemy, but he was about to design the perfect weapon to defeat it anyway. His vision was a network of underground rivers, a hidden circulatory system that would save the city from itself. Now let's step back into that quiet, orderly office and look over Joseph Bazalgette's shoulder at the maps spread across his desk. What you see is a plan of staggering ambition, a vision for reshaping the very foundations of London. It is a solution so elegant in its core concept that it seems almost obvious in retrospect, but at the time it was a revolutionary piece of civil engineering. The plan was not to replace the city's existing 100 miles of chaotic, often ancient sewers. That would have been impossibly expensive and disruptive. Instead, Bazalgette's genius was to incorporate them into a much larger, more intelligent system. He would build a brand new network of massive interceptor sewers running parallel to the River Thames. Think of it like this: the existing local sewers, which ran downhill from the streets to the river, were like the small streams and tributaries of a river system. Bazalgette's plan was to build a series of enormous man-made rivers, the interceptors, that would cut across the paths of these smaller sewers just before they reached the Thames. These new tunnels would catch, or intercept, the sewage-laden flow from the old sewers and instead of letting it spill into the river, would channel it eastward, far out of the city. It was a simple, brilliant idea. Don't block the old drains, just divert them. His system would be a hidden mirror of the Thames itself, a subterranean river of waste flowing alongside the cleansing river of water. The sheer scale of the project is breathtaking. There would be 3 main interceptors on the more populous north side of the Thames and 2 on the south side. They would be arranged at different levels: a high-level sewer to catch the waste from hilly areas like Hampstead, a middle-level sewer for areas further in, and a low-level sewer running right alongside the river to serve the lowest-lying parts of the city. This tiered design was crucial. Bazalgette was a master of using gravity. By carefully calculating the gradient of the tunnels, he could let the force of gravity do most of the work, pulling the flow eastward. The required slope was incredibly precise, a fall of just 2 feet for every mile of tunnel. This was enough to keep the sewage moving at a steady pace of about 1.5 miles per hour. Fast enough to prevent solids from settling and creating blockages, but not so fast that it would cause excessive wear on the brickwork. It was a delicate, citywide balancing act. One of the mainstream historical facts of the design is Bazalgette's famous foresight in determining the size of the tunnels. He began by calculating the pipe diameter needed to serve the current population of London. Then, in a moment of inspired genius, he took that calculation and said, "Well, we're only going to do this once, so let's double it." He instructed his draftsmen to double the diameter of all the pipes and tunnels in his plans. This single decision is the primary reason his system is still functioning over 160 years later. He didn't just plan for the London he knew, he planned for a future metropolis of double the size, a city he could barely imagine. It was an act of incredible optimism and engineering prudence that saved future generations billions of pounds and untold disruption. You can still see his beautifully rendered cross-section drawings, showing tunnels so large that you could drive a horse and cart through them. Now for a quirky and quite brilliant design tidbit: the shape of the sewers themselves. Bazalgette didn't make his tunnels circular. He designed them to be egg-shaped, with the narrower end at the bottom. This was an incredibly clever piece of hydraulic engineering. During periods of low flow, such as in the middle of the night, the narrower base would concentrate the small amount of liquid, keeping the current swift enough to wash away sediment and prevent blockages. During a heavy rainstorm, when the tunnels were full of both sewage and rainwater, the wider upper arch of the egg shape provided a much larger capacity. The egg shape made the sewers self-cleaning and adaptable to wildly fluctuating volumes. It was a simple, elegant solution that used physics to solve a practical problem. Historians still debate the environmental ethics of the plan's final stage. Bazalgette's brilliant system didn't magically make the sewage disappear, it just moved the problem somewhere else. The ultimate goal was to collect all of London's waste and dump it, untreated, into the Thames estuary at 2 outfalls, Beckton on the north bank and Crossness on the south. This was far enough downstream that the outgoing tide, he calculated, would carry the raw sewage out into the North Sea where it would disperse harmlessly. At the time, this was seen as a perfectly acceptable and logical solution. The concept of sewage treatment barely existed, and the prevailing view was out of sight, out of mind. From a 21st century perspective, it looks like a colossal act of environmental pollution. But in the context of 1858, it was a life-saving miracle. He was replacing a system that poisoned the city's heart with one that simply shifted the waste to a less populated area. It was a trade-off that everyone at the time was more than willing to make. As you look at the grand, sweeping lines on the map, you realize you're not just looking at a plan for sewers. You're looking at the blueprint for a modern, livable city. With Bazalgette's master plan approved and the funding secured, the city is about to witness an invasion, not of soldiers, but of workers. A vast, rugged army of men is needed to dig the 82 miles of massive interceptor sewers and the 1,100 miles of smaller street sewers that will connect to them. These men are the navvies. The word is a shortened form of navigator, a term originally given to the men who dug the navigation canals of the 18th century. By your time, the mid-19th century, they have become a legendary tribe of nomadic laborers, the shock troops of the Industrial Revolution. They are the ones who built the railways, the bridges, and the tunnels that transformed Britain. And now they are coming to London. Imagine you are standing on a street in a residential neighborhood. One morning, a small army of these men arrives. They are easy to spot. They are large, muscular men dressed in heavy-duty corduroy trousers, thick flannel shirts, and sturdy leather boots. They often wore brightly colored neckerchiefs, a point of pride and a way to identify themselves. Their faces are weathered from outdoor work, and their hands are like shovels themselves, calloused and powerful. They are a world apart from the pale, stooped city clerks and shopkeepers you are used to seeing. They carry with them an aura of raw physical power and a reputation for hard work, hard drinking, and hard fighting. The arrival of a navvy crew in a neighborhood was often a mixed blessing, bringing jobs and money, but also a fair bit of rowdiness to the local pubs. Their work is brutal, relentless, and almost entirely manual. You watch as they begin to excavate a massive trench down the middle of a major street. There are no steam shovels or hydraulic excavators. The primary tools are the pickaxe, the shovel, and the wheelbarrow. It is a symphony of raw human effort. One group of men, the gangers, stands at the bottom of the trench, swinging their pickaxes to break up the dense London clay. Behind them, another group shovels the loose earth into wheelbarrows. Then comes the most grueling job of all, pushing the fully laden wheelbarrows up long, steep wooden planks to the surface, where the spoil, the excavated earth, is carted away by horses. A single navvy was expected to shift about 20 tons of earth in a 10-hour workday. It was a staggering physical output that few men today could sustain. This is the mainstream historical fact of the navvies, their incredible productivity and the immense physical toll of their labor. They were paid relatively well for the time, which is what drew men from all over Britain and Ireland to the work, but the job was incredibly dangerous. Tunnel collapses, or blows, were a constant threat. Explosives were often used to clear harder ground, and accidents were common. The damp underground conditions led to diseases like rheumatism and bronchitis. The average life expectancy for a career navvy was notoriously short, often not much beyond 40 years. They were, in a very real sense, building the modern world with their bodies and shortening their own lives in the process. Now for a quirky tidbit about their culture. The navvies developed their own distinct slang and a powerful sense of group identity. They often lived in temporary camps or crowded lodging houses, forming tight-knit communities. One of their most interesting innovations was the buddy gang system. This was a form of subcontracting where a small group of navvies would band together under a leader and agree to dig a certain length of tunnel for a fixed price. It was a cooperative, entrepreneurial system that rewarded hard work and efficiency. The faster and better they worked, the more money each man in the gang made. This system fostered a fierce sense of teamwork and pride in their craft. They weren't just anonymous laborers, they were skilled professionals who understood geology, timbering, and the subtle arts of excavation in a way no university-trained engineer ever could. Historians still debate the social standing of the navvies. Were they a respected class of skilled laborers, or were they a feared and marginalized underclass? The answer is complicated. To engineers like Basil Jett, they were indispensable. To the middle-class residents whose streets they were tearing up, they were often seen as a rough, disruptive, and even dangerous presence. Newspaper accounts from the time often portray them as drunken, brawling savages, but there is also a clear sense of grudging respect for their strength and their ability to get the most difficult jobs done. They occupied a strange space in the rigid Victorian social hierarchy, looked down upon for their rough manners, but admired for the monumental structures they created. As you watch them work, covered in mud and sweat, you see the human engine that is powering this sanitary revolution. Every brick in Basil Jett's grand design would be laid by their hands, deep beneath the city streets, in a world of darkness, damp, and constant danger. They are the forgotten heroes of our story, the men whose muscle turned a brilliant idea into a physical reality. The work of the navvies is not just a matter of brute force. It is a battle against the city itself. Digging these enormous tunnels beneath one of the world's most densely populated areas is an engineering challenge of epic proportions. You are now standing at the edge of a massive construction site, looking down into a deep, timber-shored trench. The logistical complexity is mind-boggling. Every spoonful of clay they excavate has to be hauled out, and every single brick, bag of cement, and piece of timber has to be brought in, all while the city of 2.5 million people continues to thrum and clatter around you. Streets are closed, traffic is diverted, and the noise of construction is relentless. London in the 1860s is a city being torn apart so it can be put back together again in a healthier configuration. One of the first and greatest challenges is simply navigating the subterranean labyrinth that already exists beneath London's streets. This isn't virgin soil. It's a tangled web of water mains, gas pipes, and the existing, often uncharted, sewers from Roman, medieval, and Georgian times. The navvies are constantly breaking into these older structures. Sometimes they unearth a crumbling Roman sewer, its tiles still intact after 1,500 years. Other times they might hit a plague pit, a mass grave from the Black Death or the Great Plague of 1665, releasing a stench that, to their miasma-believing minds, is terrifyingly potent. The project becomes a kind of accidental archaeology, peeling back the layers of the city's history. Basil Jett's engineers have to be incredibly agile, constantly redrawing their plans on the fly to accommodate these unexpected obstacles. The mainstream historical fact of this section is the invention and use of a new type of building material, Portland cement. The tunnels had to be incredibly strong to withstand the immense pressure from the earth above and the corrosive properties of the sewage within. The traditional lime mortar used for bricklaying for centuries was not strong enough and would quickly degrade. A new, much more durable hydraulic cement had been invented a few decades earlier by a man named Joseph Aspdin, who named it Portland cement because its color resembled the high-quality building stone quarried on the Isle of Portland. Bazalgette was one of the first engineers to use this new material on a massive scale. He set up a rigorous quality control system, with inspectors testing the tensile strength of every single batch of cement before it was used. This insistence on using the best, most advanced materials is another reason his system has lasted so long. The 318 million bricks used in the project are all held together by this super-strong, water-resistant mortar. Now for a quirky engineering challenge they had to solve: crossing London's other, smaller rivers. The new interceptor sewers had to run in a straight, gently sloping line, but the landscape above was not flat. It was crisscrossed by London's lost rivers, like the Fleet, the Tyburn, and the Westburn, which had long since been covered over and turned into large sewers themselves. When the path of a new interceptor sewer intersected with one of these old river sewers, Bazalgette's engineers couldn't simply join them together, as this would disrupt the carefully calculated gravitational flow. So they designed and built some of the most ingenious and hidden structures in the city: sewer aqueducts. A prime example is where the middle-level sewer crosses the path of the old Fleet sewer near Farringdon. The engineers built a massive iron tube, like a giant water pipe, to carry the Fleet over the top of the new sewer tunnel. It's a hidden underground bridge, a river crossing a river, a structure that millions of Londoners have walked over without ever knowing it exists. Historians still debate the true human cost of these construction methods. While Bazalgette was a meticulous planner, the safety standards of the 19th century were, to put it mildly, not what they are today. Records of accidents and fatalities are incomplete, but it's clear that many navvies were killed or seriously injured during the construction. The work was particularly dangerous when tunneling through loose, waterlogged gravel deposits instead of the stable London clay. The technique they used was called cut and cover for the shallower trenches: dig a trench, build the brick tunnel, and then cover it back over. But for the deeper sections, they had to engage in true tunneling, a far riskier proposition. This is where the skill of the timberman was crucial, building temporary wooden frames to support the tunnel roof just a few feet behind the diggers. A miscalculation or a patch of bad ground could lead to an instant and deadly collapse. Bazalgette himself was not callous, but he operated within a system that viewed a certain level of worker death as an unavoidable price of progress. As you watch the endless lines of men sweating and straining in the flickering gaslight of the tunnels, you're seeing a raw, unfiltered vision of the Victorian age, an era of brilliant innovation and incredible ambition, built upon a foundation of cheap labor and expendable lives. The system Bazalgette is designing relies almost entirely on gravity, that silent, invisible force pulling London's waste gently eastward. But gravity has its limits. For the large areas of London that lie at or even below the high tide mark, places like Pimlico, Southwark, and Bermondsey, there is simply no natural downward slope towards the outfalls. The low-level sewers, which serve these areas, have to collect the waste and then, somehow, lifted up into the main outfall sewers. This presents a major engineering problem. How do you lift a river of sewage, millions of gallons a day, 30 or 40 feet into the air? The solution is a testament to the raw power of the Victorian steam age and, unexpectedly, to its surprising sense of beauty. Bazalgette's answer is to build 4 massive pumping stations at key points in the system, 2 on the south side of the Thames at Deptford and Crossness, and 2 on the north at Abbey Mills and Chelsea Embankment. These are not mere functional, utilitarian buildings. They are cathedrals of sewage. You are now standing inside the Crossness pumping station, which has been partially restored today and is open to the public. The experience is jaw-dropping. You are in a vast, octagonal hall that feels more like a cathedral's nave than a piece of industrial infrastructure. The ceiling soars high above you, supported by ornate cast-iron columns with intricate floral capitals. The ironwork is painted in rich reds, greens, and blues with delicate gold leaf highlights. The railings are of polished brass, and the brickwork is a stunning display of multicolored patterns, a style known as polychromy. It is, without a doubt, one of the most beautiful industrial buildings in the world. This is the mainstream historical fact of this section: the incredible, and to modern eyes, completely unnecessary architectural grandeur of these pumping stations. Bazalgette and his chief architect, Charles Driver, went to extraordinary lengths to make these buildings magnificent. Why? This wasn't just Victorian exuberance, it was a powerful statement. In an age that equated filth and squalor with moral decay, they were building palaces to celebrate the triumph of sanitation and civic pride. They were taking the city's most shameful secret, its waste, and housing the machinery to deal with it in a structure of breathtaking beauty. It was a way of dignifying a profoundly undignified subject, of saying, this work is so important, so vital to our civilization, that it deserves a temple. At the heart of this iron and brick cathedral are the engines themselves. This is where a quirky and frankly awesome tidbit comes in. Housed within the stunning ironwork are 4 of the largest rotative beam engines ever constructed. They are colossal machines, true giants of the steam age. Each engine has a 52-ton flywheel, 30 feet in diameter, and a massive overhead beam that rocks up and down like a seesaw. They were named after members of the royal family: Victoria, Prince Consort, Alexandra, and Albert Edward. The scale is almost impossible to comprehend. When these engines were running, the ground would have gently vibrated, and the rhythmic hiss and clank of the machinery would have filled this grand space. Their job was to power enormous pumps, which would lift over 6 tons of sewage with every single stroke, raising it from the low-level sewer up into the main outfall tunnel that would then carry it, by gravity, the rest of the way to the Thames estuary. Historians still debate the motivations behind this sewage sublime architecture. Was it a genuine expression of civic pride, or was it a form of engineering propaganda? By making the visible parts of the system so beautiful and impressive, the Metropolitan Board of Works was justifying the colossal expense of the project to the public and showcasing the prowess of British engineering to the world. It was a way of creating landmarks that would inspire awe and confidence. These buildings were a physical manifestation of the Victorian belief that technology, science, and industry could solve any problem and create a better, cleaner, more ordered world. They were monuments to the taming of chaos. You walk around the upper gallery of the engine house, looking down at the silent, majestic machines. You can run your hand along the cool, ornate ironwork, a pattern of interlaced plants and flowers. It is so utterly over the top, so wonderfully and defiantly beautiful. The men who operated these engines were highly skilled technicians, dressed in clean overalls, constantly polishing the brass fittings and oiling the gleaming machinery. It was a far cry from the muddy, dangerous world of the navvies in the tunnels below. This was the clean, respectable public face of the great sewer system. These pumping stations were the powerful, beating hearts of Bazalgette's new subterranean network, lifting the city's filth with a grace and grandeur that seems almost comical, but is also deeply moving. They are a perfect monument to the Victorian mind, obsessed with order, powered by steam, and hiding a profound anxiety about dirt and decay beneath a stunningly beautiful surface. The journey of the waste is nearing its end. After being intercepted by Bazalgette's new tunnels, flowing miles across London by the gentle pull of gravity, and, for the lowest-lying areas, being lifted by the magnificent steam-powered pumps, it all ends up here. You are standing on the remote, marshy banks of the Thames estuary, miles east of the city centre. On the north bank is the outfall at Beckton, and on the south bank, where you are now, is the even larger outfall at Crossness, right next to the beautiful pumping station we just visited. This is the final destination, the point where London's collected sewage is to be returned to the river. But even this final stage of the process is a masterpiece of careful tidal engineering. Bazalgette couldn't just open a pipe and let the sewage pour into the river continuously. If he did that, the incoming tide would simply push the filth right back up the river towards London, recreating the very problem he was trying to solve, just a few miles downstream. His solution was to build enormous, cathedral-sized underground reservoirs at each of the two outfalls. The reservoir at Crossness, for example, covered an area of 6.5 acres. That's about the size of 5 football fields, and could hold 25 million gallons of sewage. It was a vast, subterranean brick-vaulted cavern, an unseen wonder of the Victorian world. The purpose of this reservoir was to act as a giant holding tank. The sewage flowing from London would pour into this underground lake and be stored there for several hours. This is the mainstream historical fact of this part of the system. The operation was timed precisely to the rhythm of the ocean. The outlet valves of the reservoir were only opened for a 2-hour window at the very beginning of the ebb tide. You are standing by the outfall structure, a formidable brick and granite edifice. Inside, a team of engineers is watching the tide levels carefully. When the tide turns and begins to flow powerfully out to sea, they give the signal. Huge iron penstock gates are slowly winched open, and the contents of the reservoir are released into the main channel of the Thames in a massive, controlled burst. Bazalgette's calculation was that this powerful outgoing tide would carry the plume of sewage far out into the North Sea, where it would disperse and be rendered harmless by the vastness of the ocean. The system was designed to work in harmony with the natural forces of the planet, a kind of hydraulic jiu-jitsu. Now for a quirky engineering challenge they had to solve: crossing London's other, smaller rivers. The new interceptor sewers had to run in a straight, gently sloping line, but the landscape above was not flat. It was crisscrossed by London's lost rivers, like the Fleet, the Tyburn, and the Westburn, which had long since been covered over and turned into large sewers themselves. When the path of a new interceptor sewer intersected with one of these old river sewers, Balzaget's engineers couldn't simply join them together, as this would disrupt the carefully calculated gravitational flow. So they designed and built some of the most ingenious and hidden structures in the city, sewer aqueducts. A prime example is where the middle-level sewer crosses the path of the old Fleet sewer near Farringdon. The engineers built a massive iron tube, like a giant water pipe, to carry the Fleet over the top of the new sewer tunnel. It's a hidden underground bridge, a river crossing a river, a structure that millions of Londoners have walked over without ever knowing it exists. Historians still debate the true human cost of these construction methods. While Balzaget was a meticulous planner, the safety standards of the 19th century were, to put it mildly, not what they are today. Records of accidents and fatalities are incomplete, but it's clear that many navvies were killed or seriously injured during the construction. The work was particularly dangerous when tunneling through loose, waterlogged gravel deposits instead of the stable London clay. The technique they used was called cut and cover for the shallower trenches: dig a trench, build the brick tunnel, and then cover it back over. But for the deeper sections, they had to engage in true tunneling, a far riskier proposition. This is where the skill of the timberman was crucial, building temporary wooden frames to support the tunnel roof just a few feet behind the diggers. A miscalculation or a patch of bad ground could lead to an instant and deadly collapse. Balzaget himself was not callous, but he operated within the system that viewed a certain level of worker death as an unavoidable price of progress. As you watch the endless lines of men sweating and straining in the flickering gaslight of the tunnels, you're seeing a raw, unfiltered vision of the Victorian age. An era of brilliant innovation and incredible ambition, built upon a foundation of cheap labor and expendable lives. The transformation is not instantaneous, but it is remarkably swift. As the great interceptor sewers come online, section by section, throughout the 1860s, a profound change begins to occur in the heart of London. The foul lifeblood of the city is being diverted, rerouted into its new subterranean arteries, and the River Thames, for the first time in centuries, is allowed to heal. You are standing on the Victoria Embankment, one of the new public spaces we will discuss later, looking out over the water in the late 1860s. The change is visible, and it is smellable. The air no longer has that thick, cloying quality. The ever-present, throat-catching stench of raw sewage is gone. It is replaced by the cleaner, brackish smell of a tidal estuary, the scent of salt, wet mud, and river water. This is the most immediate and celebrated effect of Balzaget's system. The great stinks, which had plagued London during hot summers, simply ceased to happen. The river, which had been a source of national shame and terror, slowly begins to reclaim its former dignity. The water itself starts to look different. While it is still a muddy brown, a natural state for a tidal river carrying silt, it is no longer the viscous, bubbling slurry of the 1850s. The thick, greasy film of human and industrial waste disappears. You can see the current again, the swirl and eddy of the tides. And perhaps most miraculously, life begins to return. The public reaction is one of overwhelming relief and civic pride. The newspapers, which had once printed daily columns on the state of the Thames with morbid descriptions of its foulness, now celebrate the river's purification. Bazalgette, once a quietly competent but largely unknown public servant, is hailed as a national hero. He is the man who cleaned the Thames, the engineer who slew the great stinking dragon. When the full system is officially opened by the Prince of Wales in 1865 at a grand ceremony at Crossness Pumping Station, the speeches are filled with soaring rhetoric about the triumph of science, progress, and British ingenuity. It is a moment of profound national satisfaction. They had faced a problem that seemed insurmountable, one that threatened the very viability of their capital city, and they had conquered it with brick, iron, and steam. Now for a quirky and quite telling social consequence of the cleaner river. With the stench gone, the Thames becomes a place for recreation again. Boating for pleasure, which had been an activity reserved for the very brave or those with no sense of smell, becomes fashionable once more. Regattas and rowing races return to the urban stretches of the river. Perhaps most importantly, the new embankments built over the low-level sewer become fashionable promenades where Londoners of all classes can stroll and enjoy the waterfront. The river is no longer something to be avoided, a place you hurry past with a handkerchief held to your nose. It is becoming, once again, the beautiful centerpiece of the city. One historian noted that the cleaning of the Thames fundamentally changed London's relationship with its own river, turning it from an embarrassing backyard sewer into a grand public front parlor. Historians still debate the precise timeline of the river's recovery. While the most egregious pollution was stopped, the Thames was by no means pristine. It still received a huge amount of runoff from the streets, and industrial pollution from factories further upstream and downstream continued for many decades. The river would face new ecological crises in the 20th century, particularly from chemical pollutants. Some argue that the Victorian celebration of a purified Thames was premature, a self-congratulatory narrative that overlooked the continuing environmental damage. However, there is no denying the dramatic improvement in the immediate conditions. Compared to the anaerobic sewer of 1858, the Thames of 1870 was a different world. The simple fact that people could breathe the air near the river without gagging was a revolution in the quality of daily life for millions of Londoners. The most obvious and offensive symptoms of the city's sickness had been cured. As you gaze at the water, seeing a small fishing boat bobbing on the tide, you are witnessing a quiet miracle. The river is breathing again, and with it, the entire city seems to take a long, deep, and satisfying breath of fresh air. The age of the great stink is over. The city is breathing freely, the river is cleaner, and Joseph Bazalgette is celebrated as a hero for banishing the great stink. By every measure the Victorians used, the project is an unqualified, triumphant success. But the sewer system's greatest achievement was almost entirely accidental. It was a victory over an enemy that Bazalgette and his fellow miasmatists didn't even know they were fighting. Remember Dr. John Snow and his lonely, ignored theory that cholera was spread not by foul air, but by contaminated water? As the new sewer system began to operate, his controversial ideas were about to be vindicated on a massive and city-wide scale. The great unintended consequence of the new sewers was the conquest of cholera. Let's trace the connection. The old system, a chaotic mix of overflowing cesspits and leaky local sewers, meant that human waste was constantly seeping into the ground beneath the city. This is a critical point. The shallow wells and public pumps from which a huge portion of London's population got their drinking water were drawing from this same contaminated ground. The water might look clear, but it was often a toxic soup of bacteria. The Broad Street pump, which Snow had identified as the source of the 1854 Soho outbreak, was a perfect example of this deadly, invisible connection between sewage and drinking water. Bazalgette's new system changed everything. By intercepting the sewage before it could saturate the ground and whisking it away in sealed, deep-level tunnels, he was inadvertently sanitizing London's water table. He was cutting the primary transmission route for waterborne diseases like cholera and typhoid fever. The mainstream historical fact here is the dramatic decline in death rates from these diseases after the sewers became operational. The evidence is stark and undeniable. London had suffered a major cholera epidemic roughly every 10 years since the 1930s. Another one was statistically due in the mid-1960s. And in 1866 it arrived. Cholera broke out in a small isolated section of London's East End. Crucially, this was one of the few areas of the city that had not yet been connected to Bazalgette's new system. Over 5,000 people died in that localized outbreak, a tragic but scientifically powerful event. It acted as a grim control group in a massive public health experiment. In the parts of London with the new sewers, cholera was almost non-existent. In the one part without them, it was as deadly as ever. The connection was impossible to ignore. This event finally broke the back of the miasma theory. The evidence was too strong. Dr. Snow had been right all along. Now for a quirky and somewhat tragic tidbit. John Snow himself never lived to see his theories so spectacularly proven. He had died in 1858, the very year of the Great Stink, from a stroke at the age of just 45. He died in relative obscurity, his groundbreaking work still largely dismissed by the medical establishment. It was only after his death, when the data from the 1866 epidemic came in, that his ideas were finally and widely accepted. The official report into that epidemic, written by William Farr, who had been one of Snow's most powerful critics, finally admitted that the morbid matter of cholera was being spread through the water supply, just as Snow had argued. It was a posthumous victory, a quiet vindication for the unassuming doctor who had followed the evidence instead of the prevailing dogma. Historians still debate how to properly assign credit for this public health miracle. Was Bazalgette the true hero, even if he was acting on a flawed theory? Or should the credit go to John Snow, whose correct theory provided the intellectual framework for understanding why the sewers worked? It's a classic case of right actions for the wrong reasons. Bazalgette built the sewers to stop a bad smell from causing an airborne disease. In doing so, he accidentally stopped a waterborne bacterium he didn't know existed. It's a powerful lesson in the law of unintended consequences. Bazalgette's pragmatism and engineering brilliance had a far greater impact than he could have ever imagined. He set out to solve an aesthetic and olfactory problem, and ended up saving hundreds of thousands of lives from a disease he misunderstood. As you walk through a London neighborhood in the 1870s, you can feel the change in the atmosphere. It's more than just the absence of a bad smell. There is an absence of a certain kind of fear. The periodic terror of the cholera epidemics, which had haunted the city for a generation, has lifted. Parents no longer have to live in constant dread that their children might be struck down overnight by the Blue Death. This newfound security, this freedom from the recurring nightmare of epidemic disease, is the true, hidden legacy of those millions of bricks laid in the darkness beneath the city. Bazalgette may have aimed at the wrong target, but his aim was so true and the weapon he built was so powerful that he hit the right one by mistake. Bazalgette's grand project was not confined to the darkness beneath the streets. His work would rise up to dramatically and permanently reshape the very face of London. As part of his plan for the low-level sewer on the north bank of the Thames, he had to build a massive tunnel running right alongside the river, through the very heart of the city. The easiest way to do this was not to tunnel under the existing maze of riverside wharves and buildings, but to build the tunnel out in the riverbed itself, and then reclaim the land on top of it. This practical engineering decision gave birth to one of London's most iconic features, the Thames embankments. You are standing on a wide, sweeping promenade paved with granite and lined with ornamental trees and elegant cast-iron benches in the shape of sphinxes and camels, a nod to Britain's imperial reach. This is the Victoria Embankment, opened in 1870. To your right is the bustling traffic of the city. To your left, the now cleaner River Thames flows past. This entire magnificent public space, over a mile long, is essentially the roof of a sewer. Beneath your feet, deep inside the massive granite retaining wall, are 3 parallel tunnels. The largest, at the bottom, is the low-level interceptor sewer, carrying the waste from Pimlico and Westminster eastward. Above it, there's a smaller subway for utilities like gas and water pipes, and at the very top, cleverly integrated into the structure, is a tunnel for a brand new underground railway, the District Line. It was a masterpiece of multi-purpose urban planning. The creation of the embankments, the Victoria on the north bank, the Albert on the south, and the Chelsea further upstream, is the mainstream historical fact of this phase of the project. They were a massive undertaking in their own right, reclaiming over 37 acres of land from the muddy, foul-smelling river foreshore. This had several profound effects. Firstly, it narrowed and deepened the river. This increased the speed of the current, which helped to scour the riverbed and prevent the formation of the mud banks that had contributed to the stink. Secondly, it created a magnificent new boulevard for the city, a grand public space that relieved traffic congestion and provided Londoners with a beautiful place to walk, socialize, and enjoy their river. Grand hotels, government buildings, and public gardens soon sprang up along its length. But there's a quirky, almost forgotten consequence of this grand civic improvement. The creation of the embankments fundamentally altered the relationship between London and its river. For centuries, the city had met the Thames in a messy, chaotic jumble of private wharves, docks, stairs, and slum dwellings that went right down to the water's edge. It was a working, porous boundary. Bazalgette's solid granite walls changed that forever. They created a hard, clean, formal separation between the city and the river. This had the unfortunate effect of cutting off many of the traditional watermen and ferrymen from their livelihoods, as their old landing spots were simply erased. One of the most famous and poignant casualties was the Grand Watergate of York House, a beautiful 17th century archway. It was originally built right on the riverbank so that nobles could step directly from their boats into their gardens. After the Victoria Embankment was built, the arch was left stranded, high and dry, 100 yards from the new river's edge, where it still stands today, a curious monument to a lost world. Historians still debate the social impact of the embankments. Were they a democratic public space for all, or an act of social engineering designed to sanitize and control the unruly riverfront? On one hand, they were genuinely popular and provided much-needed green space and fresh air for a crowded city. On the other hand, their construction involved the demolition of many poor riverside communities, displacing thousands of people. The project cleared away the messy, vibrant, and often squalid world of the mudlarks, the fishermen, and the dock workers, replacing it with a grand, orderly, and distinctly middle-class vision of what a riverfront should be. It was a classic Victorian improvement, cleaner, grander, more efficient, and with a subtle but definite element of social control. As you lean on the granite parapet, watching a steam-powered tugboat chug past, you are standing on a monument to Basil Jett's holistic vision. He didn't just see a sewage problem, he saw an opportunity to completely reimagine the city's relationship with its river. He took a project born of filth and fear and used it to create a space of beauty, order, and public recreation. The embankments are the most visible and beautiful legacy of the fight against the Great Stink. They are a permanent reminder that the solution to London's most disgusting problem is also the foundation for one of its most celebrated public spaces. The city's greatest shame was buried, and on its grave, they built a park. The years pass. The Victorian age, with its boundless confidence and steam-powered ambitions, gives way to the anxieties of the 20th century. London grows, spreads, and modernizes in ways Joseph Bazalgette could have scarcely imagined. Yet, deep beneath the city, his creation endures. The great interceptor sewers, the cathedrals of sewage, the graceful egg-shaped tunnels, they continue their silent, vital work, day in and day out. You are now standing in the present day, looking at a modern map of London's infrastructure. Superimposed on the tangle of underground lines, fiber optic cables, and utility tunnels, you can still trace the grand, sweeping lines of Bazalgette's original system. It is the deep, foundational skeleton upon which the modern city is built. The incredible longevity of the system is the final and perhaps most impressive mainstream historical fact of our story. Bazalgette's decision to double the size of the tunnels, his insistence on using the highest quality materials like Portland cement, and the sheer brilliance of his gravitational design have allowed the system to function effectively for over 160 years. It has survived the Blitz, the explosive growth of the suburbs, and the advent of the skyscraper. While it has been expanded and upgraded over the decades, the core of the network, the great interceptor sewers, is still the same one laid by the hands of those navvies in the 1860s. It is arguably the single most important and durable piece of infrastructure in London's history. Without it, the modern megacity of nearly 9 million people simply could not exist. However, the shadow of this Victorian giant also presents modern London with a colossal challenge. Bazalgette's system was designed for a city of 4 million people. Today, more than double that number rely on it. The system is overloaded. This leads to a quirky and unpleasant modern problem. The sewers were designed with emergency storm overflows, allowing excess rainwater and sewage to discharge directly into the Thames during heavy storms to prevent it from backing up into streets and homes. In Bazalgette's time, this might have happened a few times a year. Today, with the vast increase in population and the paving over of green spaces which reduces natural drainage, these overflows happen dozens of times a year, sometimes even with light rainfall. Tens of millions of tons of raw sewage are discharged into the Thames annually. In a strange, ironic twist of history, the river is once again facing a serious pollution problem. Not because the old system has failed, but because it has become a victim of its own success and the city's relentless growth. Historians and engineers now debate the future of London's sanitation. How do you replace or supplement a system that is so deeply embedded in the fabric of the city? The answer, currently under construction, is a project that is a direct spiritual successor to Bazalgette's own grand vision. It is a new, even deeper sewer tunnel called the Thames Tideway Tunnel, or the Super Sewer. It is a massive 15-mile-long tunnel, wide enough to fit 3 double-decker buses side by side, being dug far beneath Bazalgette's own tunnels. Its sole purpose is to intercept the sewage from the 34 most polluting storm overflows and carry it to the treatment works at Beckton. It is, in essence, an interceptor for the interceptors. It's a 21st century solution that follows the exact same engineering logic Bazalgette pioneered in the 19th century. The ghost of the quiet engineer still guides the hands of those who build beneath London. As our journey comes to a close, we reflect on the sheer scale of the achievement. Joseph Bazalgette and his army of navvies didn't just build a sewer, they built the foundation for the modern metropolis. They defeated cholera, banished the Great Stink, created the iconic embankments, and gave London the room it needed to breathe and grow. They took a city that was literally choking on its own success and gave it a future. It is a hidden masterpiece, a vast, functional work of art that most Londoners will never see, but upon which their entire daily lives depend. It is a quiet, steady monument to the power of careful planning, rational thought, and the audacious belief that even the most overwhelming problems can be solved with enough bricks, ingenuity, and quiet determination. And so, as the city above you prepares to sleep, the silent rivers beneath your feet continue their ceaseless, gentle flow. The system carries away the remnants of the day, a hidden, constant guardian of the city's health. The work is never truly done, but the foundation laid by that quiet Victorian giant remains strong, a steady presence in the deep, dark soil. The memory of the Great Stink has faded into a distant, almost unbelievable story, a testament to a time when a bad smell could bring an empire to its knees, and a calm engineer with a brilliant plan could, quite literally, save a city from itself. The air is clear, the water is cleaner, and deep in the earth, the legacy of Joseph Bazalgette flows on, a quiet and constant reassurance that order can, and did, emerge from the most profound chaos. Tonight, we've walked the foul-smelling streets of a city in crisis and descended into the dark, damp tunnels that became its salvation. We've seen how a problem so overwhelming it could paralyze a government was solved not with panic, but with patience, precision, and an extraordinary vision for the future. Joseph Bazalgette's great sewers are more than just a feat of engineering. They are a quiet story of hope, a reminder that even the most daunting challenges can be overcome with careful thought and steady effort. As this story fades, perhaps you can imagine that sense of profound relief, The simple, quiet joy of breathing fresh, clean air by a river that is finally healing. Let that feeling of a problem solved, of a crisis averted, settle over you now. Let the gentle, constant, and invisible flow of those subterranean rivers become a soft, lulling rhythm in the back of your mind. There is no more chaos, no more stench, only the steady, predictable hum of a system working perfectly in the darkness. Allow your own thoughts to flow away just as easily, drifting downstream into a place of quiet and rest. There is nothing more for you to solve tonight. The work is done. All that is left is to drift peacefully and to sleep deeply.